When I first opened the envelope, my hands were still greasy from fixing the belt drive on a damn furnace that wouldn't stop squealing. It had been another long day, 12 hours at the plant, the kind of day where you come home and collapse into your recliner with your boots still on. The invitation was thick, heavy, cream-colored, with elegant gold lettering that spelled out what should have been one of the proudest moments of my life. Jason Dalton and Madison Carter request the honor of your presence. I didn't even make it past the first line before my throat tightened. I sat there in my one-bedroom rental, the ceiling fan clicking overhead, just staring at it. My boy, getting married. And not just married, he was marrying into the Carter family. The kind of people who drink wine you can't pronounce and think a calloused hand means you've made bad life choices. I could almost hear Madison's father now, Mr. Douglas Carter, senior partner at some massive law firm in Chicago, sizing me up like I was something stuck to his shoe. It wasn't paranoia. I'd met them once, briefly, when Jason graduated. Her parents were all practiced smiles and small talk, and the moment I mentioned I worked in maintenance, I saw the flicker of disinterest pass across her mother's face like a shadow. I raised Jason alone. His mom left when he was barely 2. Said she couldn't handle the small-town life, the long hours, the worn-out dreams. I never heard from her again after the divorce papers arrived. From then on, it was just me and Jason against the world. I learned how to braid his hair for school picture day. I sat through every cold morning soccer practice, packed every lunch, stitched every ripped backpack strap. I missed promotions at work just so I could be there for spelling bees and science fairs. And now he's made it. Built his own business from the ground up, marketing or consulting or something too complicated for me to explain to the guys at the plant, but he made it. I should be over the moon. But instead, I felt like I was holding something that didn't belong to me. The invitation might as well have been written in another language. There was going to be a rehearsal dinner at some rooftop venue, a black tie event with valet parking and a string quartet. I had to rent a tux just to attend, and I hadn't worn one since my cousin's funeral 10 years ago. Even then, I borrowed that suit. The closest thing I owned to formal wear was a flannel shirt without stains. Jason's been good about it all, always respectful, never acting ashamed of me. But there's a certain way he talks now, polished and careful, like he's trying to soften everything for my benefit. He said, "Dad, I'd really love for you to give a toast at the reception," and I laughed it off like it was no big deal, but inside, I panicked. What the hell would I even say? Here's to the kid who used to fall asleep in the passenger seat of my pickup after late shifts because I couldn't afford a babysitter? That doesn't exactly pair well with champagne and filet mignon. I didn't tell him any of this. I just smiled and said, "Of course, son. I'd be honored." But as the wedding got closer, the anxiety grew. I started having dreams, strange ones. I was at the wedding, surrounded by hundreds of well-dressed strangers, and when I opened my mouth to speak, nothing came out. I'd wake up with the sheets damp and twisted around me, heart pounding. At work, I was distracted, messing up basic things. Dave, my coworker, asked me if everything was okay. I lied and told him I just wasn't sleeping well. The truth was, I felt like an imposter. Not because I was ashamed of who I was, but because I knew the world Jason was stepping into, and I didn't belong in it. It's not just money. It's mannerisms, posture, the way they laugh with closed mouths and say things like, quaint, when they mean, pathetic. I'd spent my whole life making do, patching things up, surviving. These people, they were born polished. And through it all, I kept thinking about the day I bought Jason his first bike. I'd saved up for weeks, skipping meals, working overtime. When I gave it to him, he hugged me so hard I thought my ribs would crack. That bike might have cost me nearly a month's pay, but to him, it was everything. Now here I was, holding an invitation that probably cost more than the bike did, wondering if anything I'd done over the years was going to matter in a room full of people who thought love came wrapped in trust funds and vacation homes. Still, I circled the date on the calendar. June 15th. I marked it in red ink and taped the invitation to the fridge. Not because I needed a reminder, I wouldn't forget that day if I tried, but because it felt like I had to prepare myself. Like I was gearing up for something bigger than just a wedding. It felt like a final exam I hadn't studied for. Or worse, like I was being tested for something I didn't even know I'd been part of. And the closer it got, the more that gut feeling twisted inside me. That no matter how proud Jason was of me, no matter how many stories I had of scraped knees and bedtime lullabies, none of it would count. Not to the Carters. Maybe not even to the people Jason now called friends. I'd be the man in the corner, trying not to spill his drink on a rented tux, praying no one asked what I did for a living. The drive up to the Carter estate felt like stepping into another world. Wrought iron gates opened slowly in front of me, operated by a man in a white-gloved uniform who didn't even glance at my ID. The gravel was too clean to be real gravel, probably imported from some fancy quarry in Italy, the kind of detail only people with too much money think about. My old '98 Ford pickup coughed its way up the drive, groaning beneath the contrast of its rusted bed and the manicured perfection of the estate. On either side of me, sleek black Bentleys and silver Teslas gleamed under the afternoon sun. One Porsche 911 had vanity plates that read "Esq Wife." I laughed under my breath, but it didn't stick. The mansion looked like something off a movie set. White stone columns, tall as telephone poles, stretched toward a sky so blue it looked artificial. Marble fountains gurgled on either side of the grand entrance, and the whole place smelled faintly of roses, hundreds of them, carefully arranged into spirals and arches and towering columns of red and white. I took a deep breath, smoothed down the lapels of the rented tux, and grabbed the envelope with my name on it from the valet stand. They didn't even blink at my truck. I guess they were too well trained to show surprise. Inside, the air was cool and thick with money. The floors were some kind of polished stone, probably marble, and the chandeliers hanging above looked like they belonged in a European cathedral. A live string quartet played something delicate and beautiful that I didn't recognize, and people milled around holding champagne flutes, laughing in that clipped, polite way rich people do when they know everyone is watching. I tried to keep my head up, tried not to fidget in the stiff collar, but the tux itched like hell and the shoes felt 2 sizes too tight. I scanned the crowd, hoping to find Jason. I hadn't seen him yet. A few people offered thin smiles as they walked by me, those tight-lipped, disinterested expressions that say more about politeness than kindness. One man in a navy suit gave me a once-over and moved on like I wasn't worth engaging. Eventually, someone pointed me toward the garden where the seating was set up. Rows of tables covered in white linens and ornate floral arrangements stretched across the back lawn. Waitstaff buzzed around like bees, carrying silver trays of hors d'oeuvres and glasses of something pink with mint leaves floating in it. I clutched my place card, trying not to wrinkle it with my sweating fingers. Then I saw the table. Way in the back, tucked behind a pillar and a massive floral arrangement that could have hidden a small car. My name was on one of the cards, next to a few other folks who looked just as uncomfortable as I felt. An older man in a clip-on tie who I recognized as Mr. Green, the retired janitor from Jason's elementary school. A frail woman I vaguely remembered from the local grocery store checkout line. And Cal, good old Cal, my buddy from back when we poured the concrete for my garage in '05, grinning like he'd wandered into the wrong movie. I laughed, mostly to keep from choking on my own humiliation. This must be the blue-collar VIP section, I joked, and Cal chuckled, but there was something sad behind it. Then I looked down at my place card. My name was there in bold print, but underneath it were the words that knocked the air out of my lungs like a gut punch: Frank Dalton, low-educated custodian. Pseudo-father. At first, I thought it was a mistake. A bad joke. Something someone had typed wrong and no one caught. But the longer I stared at it, the more I realized it wasn't a mistake, it was exactly what it looked like. A label. A judgment. A calculated slap in the face disguised as formality. I didn't even sit down. I just stood there, holding the card like it was something filthy. My ears rang, and the garden around me blurred. I could still hear the music, still smell the roses, but all of it felt fake. Distant. I'd braced myself for disapproval, for glances and whispers and polite condescension. But this was different. This was deliberate humiliation. Low-educated custodian. Pseudo-father. That second part hit harder than the first. I had raised that boy. I gave up everything to make sure he had a chance. And now someone, maybe a planner, maybe someone in Madison's family, had looked at my name and decided that father wasn't accurate enough. That because I didn't have a college degree, because I didn't drive a luxury car or wear cufflinks, I didn't count. I wanted to crumple the card, toss it in the nearest champagne bucket and walk back to my truck. But I just stood there, stunned, while the celebration rolled on around me. Waiters passed by with trays of caviar canapes. A woman in a lavender gown laughed like glass breaking. I felt like I was underwater, like every sound was happening on the other side of a wall. Eventually, I sat down, not because I wanted to, but because my legs felt like they couldn't hold me up anymore. Cal leaned over and whispered, "They spelled my name wrong. Caleb with a K." My mother would roll over in her grave. I tried to laugh, but it caught in my throat. My hands were still shaking, and I had to hide them under the table. Every insecurity I'd worked so hard to bury came roaring back, loud and sharp and cruel. I wasn't just out of place. I was being reminded, in black and white ink, that I didn't belong here. Not really. Not in their eyes. The worst part? I didn't know if Jason had seen the cards. Didn't know if he knew what they said. I wanted to believe he didn't. I needed to believe that. Because if he did, if he saw that card and let it stand, I wasn't sure I could forgive it. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I gripped the place card tighter, like if I held it hard enough it might change what it said. But the words stayed burned into the paper, into my brain. Low-educated custodian. Pseudo-father. Cal leaned over, saw it, and I watched the grin drain from his face. His eyes narrowed as he turned to me, furious, but not at me. "You seeing this?" he muttered, his voice low and tight. I couldn't answer. My throat had gone dry. Next to me, Mrs. Dorsey, the old babysitter who used to watch Jason when I picked up double shifts, let out a sharp little gasp when she read my card. She pressed a hand to her chest like she'd seen someone fall down. "That can't be right," she said, looking up at me with something close to horror. "Frank, that can't be right." But it was. And just beyond them, across the aisle, standing near the tented bar with a flute of something pale and expensive in her hand, was Elaine Carter. I hadn't noticed her before. But now she was watching me, watching us. She leaned in slightly toward her husband Gregory and whispered something behind that sculpted smile of hers. He glanced over at our table, at me, and then both of them laughed. Openly. Casually. Like it was all a little joke. I felt my ears go hot. It wasn't just them. Two men in tailored suits at a nearby table were now openly staring at my card, pointing, whispering. One woman in a green gown looked at me like I was a novelty act. Their laughter wasn't loud, but it didn't have to be. It slid beneath the music, beneath the clinking of glasses and soft murmur of conversation, cutting deeper than a shout ever could. I couldn't breathe. I started to push my chair back. The legs scraped the stone patio with a screech. I didn't care. My knees felt weak and I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. "I'm just gonna head out," I mumbled, more to myself than anyone. I could hear Cal say my name, Mrs. Dorsey calling softly, but I couldn't stay there a second longer. I couldn't sit at a table labeled like a charity case while those people smiled and drank and laughed like I was a joke someone dared to invite. But before I could step away, I heard footsteps. Fast. Heavy. Jason. He appeared beside me out of nowhere, tuck's jacket half unbuttoned, his eyes locked on the card in my hand. His brow was furrowed, jaw clenched. "Dad," he said, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, "what the hell is this?" I tried to hide the card, fold it up, pretend it wasn't worth making a scene over. "It's nothing," I said, my voice low. "Let's not do this here." But he took the card from my hand before I could stop him. His eyes scanned it. His face changed. Whatever light had been behind his smile all day disappeared in an instant. He looked up slowly. First at me, then toward the front, where the head table sat beneath hanging crystal lights and a monogrammed banner of their names. Madison sat there, perfectly composed, surrounded by bridesmaids in matching pastels, her phone in one hand. Jason looked further. His eyes found her parents. Elaine and Gregory Carter were now watching him, too, expressions unreadable. Elaine's smile hadn't faltered. Jason turned back to me, but he wasn't the same kid I raised. Something in him had hardened. He looked around the garden, at the guests, the servers, the music. Then, in a voice that cut through the entire damn event, loud and sharp and furious, he shouted, "Madison, we need to talk. Now." The quartet stopped playing mid-song. Chairs scraped. Glasses paused mid-air. 200, maybe 300 guests froze and turned toward us. Madison slowly stood, clearly surprised but still composed, as if unsure if this was part of the plan or some elaborate speech. "Jason," she began, too sweet, too controlled, "what's wrong?" He held up the card. The one with that label. His voice was colder now. "Did you see this?" he asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Because if you didn't, your parents sure as hell did." Elaine, to her credit, didn't flinch. She reached for Gregory's arm like this was all still salvageable. But Jason wasn't finished. He walked forward, past tables of stunned guests, holding the card high like a flag. "Who wrote this?" he demanded, looking around. "Who thought this was okay? Because I want names." No one answered. The air was dead still. All the warmth of the day had vanished, replaced by tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The waitstaff froze, wine bottles still in hand. A little kid at the next table whispered to her dad, and he quietly pulled her into his lap. Jason looked back at me, then down at the card again. This man, he said, louder now, angrier, worked 3 jobs when I was a kid. He missed meals to make sure I never had to. He built our house with his bare hands, and he raised me alone. You want to talk about family? You want to talk about what matters? He's the reason I made it here today. The card shook in his hand. And you call him a pseudo-father? A silence fell heavier than any I've ever felt. Madison stood frozen. Elaine's smile was gone now. Gregory looked like he wanted to melt into the floor. A few guests at other tables shifted uncomfortably, eyes cast down. Jason looked at his fiancée again. Madison, he said, quieter now but still firm, if this is how you and your family treat the people I love, then we've got a real problem. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't believe what I was hearing. But for the first time that day, I felt seen. Not just by Jason, but by everyone. Madison's face had gone pale. The blush and highlighter that had been so carefully applied for the photos now looked almost ghostly against the shock setting into her expression. She stepped around the table with uncertain grace, the long train of her dress whispering behind her as she approached Jason. Everyone was still watching. No one moved. You could hear the wind through the trees and the slow dying out of the final string note the quartet had left hanging in the air. She reached him and held up both hands like she wanted to calm him, to somehow contain the wildfire that was already ripping through the middle of their perfect day. Jason, I swear to you, I didn't approve that. I didn't even see the place cards until we sat down. Her voice cracked in the middle. Whether from guilt or panic, I couldn't tell. Jason stared at her for a long moment. You could see the war going on behind his eyes. Part of him still wanted to believe her, to find a way this could all be undone, chalked up to a mistake or some twisted attempt at humor. But then his head turned slowly, deliberately, toward Elaine Carter. She was seated now, but I saw the way she tensed. Her posture shifted like someone who was used to being in control but now wasn't sure which way to pivot. Jason's voice cut through the quiet again, aimed like a blade. You did this, didn't you? Elaine didn't deny it. Didn't apologize either. She just gave that same shallow wave she'd used earlier at the bar, like brushing away lint. Jason, she said with a forced little laugh, it was meant to be cheeky. Light-hearted. You know, satire. Don't tell me your father can't take a joke. A murmur moved through the crowd like a ripple across still water. Jason's jaw clenched so tightly I thought he might break his teeth. Before he could answer, Gregory Carter, still sitting at their ornate table, leaned forward with the bored authority of a man used to dictating how rooms should feel. Jason, he said in a tone I imagine he reserved for associates who forgot their place, let's not turn a joyous day into some emotional crusade. You know how much this wedding cost. You know how many important guests are here. These things come with expectations. Traditions. Your father has a background that, well, it simply doesn't align with certain standards. We didn't invent class differences. We just acknowledged them. That was it. Jason took a breath, stepped back from Madison, and raised his voice again, not in anger now, but with the kind of clarity that settles in a man when he realizes he's standing in the exact moment where everything changes. You think I care about the money, he said, looking straight at Gregory, but his words were for everyone. You think this is about floral arrangements and wine pairings and imported linens? You think I care what some partner at a law firm thinks of the man who gave up his life so I could have mine? He turned then, eyes sweeping across the stunned faces surrounding us. Let me tell you all something, since apparently not everyone in this tent knows who Frank Dalton is. My father is the man who got up at 4 in the morning to make my lunch before school. Who learned how to cook after my mom left, so I wouldn't grow up on fast food. Who taught himself algebra in his 40s, on YouTube, just so he could help me with my math homework. He's the man who never missed a single parent-teacher conference, even when he worked 18-hour days and showed up in his uniform with oil on his boots. Jason's voice didn't tremble. It was steady, furious, proud. He is the reason I know what hard work looks like. He is the reason I know what loyalty means. And love. And sacrifice. Everything I am, every success I've had, started with that man sitting right there. My chest tightened, my throat burned, and I had to grip the edge of the table to stay grounded. I didn't know whether to cry or run out of the tent and disappear. I had never been the center of attention in my life, not like this. And I sure as hell hadn't expected it now. Jason kept going. You want pedigree? You want status, he snapped, his eyes flashing toward Elaine now. Then look at the only man here who built something from nothing. You want to talk about who's worthy? My father is the best man I've ever known. And if you think it's okay to humiliate him, to label him, to reduce him to some punchline in front of 300 people, you don't deserve to be in the same room as him. There was complete silence. Even the birds had stopped chirping. People weren't even pretending to sip their champagne anymore. Jason took one last look around, and then he said it, firm, final, and loud enough that no one could misunderstand. I'm leaving. He didn't look at Madison. Didn't wait for applause or answers. He simply walked straight toward me. And every step he took felt like a thunderclap. Jason didn't hesitate. Right there in front of 300 people, lawyers, judges, CEOs, polished heirs in rented tuxedos and women in floor-length gowns he didn't recognize, he took off his jacket. He didn't throw it or fold it neatly. He just slipped it off and let it hang over the back of the nearest chair like it weighed nothing to him anymore. That silence, the kind that makes your skin prickle, stretched over the crowd like a tarp. No one spoke. No one dared. Madison stepped forward. Her face had crumpled, not with rage but disbelief. She reached out, one hand trembling slightly, mascara already starting to streak. "Jason, please," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "Don't do this. Not like this. It's just a card, a stupid, tasteless joke." Jason didn't even slow down. He turned to her, stopped just long enough to meet her eyes, and I saw the softness in him vanish. His voice was calm, but there was nothing forgiving in it. "It's not just the card," he said. "It's what it represents. That someone thought that was funny. That they thought labeling my father was acceptable. That you let a room full of people like this define what respect looks like. That I was supposed to smile through it, thank them for their cruelty, and keep going like it didn't cut me in half." Madison didn't follow him after that. He came straight to me. Didn't say anything. Just nodded once, like a man making peace with the last piece of a puzzle, and gestured toward the parking lot. I followed. We walked past all the stunned faces, through the arch of imported roses, past the valet who still held someone else's keys in confusion. Jason loosened his tie as we walked and tossed it into a trash bin beside the catering tent. When we reached my truck, the '98 Ford with rust creeping around the fender and a stubborn squeak in the passenger side door, he didn't even flinch. He opened the door, climbed in like he'd done 1,000 times as a kid, and exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for weeks. I looked over at him, hands still on the wheel, unsure if I was dreaming. "You sure about this?" He laughed. Really laughed. The kind that comes from deep in the gut, not polite or performative. "Dad," he said, leaning his head back against the seat, "this is the most sure I've felt in months." We pulled out of the Carter estate, two figures in a beat-up truck slipping past Bentleys and polished chauffeurs. No one followed. No one stopped us. The last thing I saw in the side mirror was Elaine Carter standing in the doorway, frozen, one hand over her mouth like she couldn't believe her script had gone off course. The drive back home was quiet, but not heavy. No tension, no weight hanging in the air. Just windows down, wind pouring in, and the low hum of the engine that had kept going long after it should have died. Jason rolled down his window like he used to, resting his elbow on the edge, and smiled out at the open road like he'd escaped a cage. When we pulled into the lot behind my building, the same one where I'd lived for nearly 2 decades above Danner's Hardware, Jason looked up at the chipped brick, the crooked gutters, the weather-beaten sign that always hung a little too low over the back stairwell. And he said, "God, I miss this." I unlocked the door to my apartment, the same 2-bedroom I'd raised him in, and he stepped inside like he had muscle memory for every creak in the floorboards. The kitchen was small, the linoleum worn down near the fridge, and a few dishes still sat in the sink from breakfast. But it smelled like coffee and old wood, and for the first time all day, nothing felt fake. Jason dropped into one of the old kitchen chairs, the one with the little wobble on the left leg, and stretched his arms. I poured us both a cup from the pot I'd brewed that morning, burnt, slightly bitter, but familiar. He took a sip, grinned, and looked around like he was seeing it all for the first time again. The photos taped to the fridge, the calendar with appointments crossed out in red pen, the stack of mail beside the fruit bowl. "This has always been home," he said. Not like a question. Like a truth he just walked back into after forgetting it for a while. I didn't know what to say. I just sat across from him and nodded, my hands wrapped around the chipped mug I'd had since he was in middle school. I could still see the imprint of his tiny fingerprints in the plaster handprint he'd made for me in 3rd grade, hanging just above the light switch. He looked at it too, and smiled. There was no regret. Not in his face, not in his words. Just relief. And pride. And for the first time in a long, long while, I let myself breathe. The call came at 8:03 the next morning. I was still in my bathrobe, halfway through my second cup of coffee, the one I always have before deciding whether to fix the faucet or finally patch the drywall in the hallway. I didn't recognize the number. The voice on the other end was crisp, clipped, professional, but nervous. She identified herself as a senior associate at Carter Law Group and said the managing partner was requesting an urgent meeting with me. Not Jason. Me. She said it couldn't wait. For a few seconds, I thought it was some leftover attempt at damage control from the wedding, maybe even a backhanded apology dressed up as professionalism. But something in her voice didn't sound rehearsed. It sounded rattled. I asked if Jason would be there. She paused, then said, he already was. That's when I knew something bigger was happening. I pulled on the same suit pants from the day before, ironed a shirt the best I could, and took the bus into downtown. I didn't ask Jason for a ride. I didn't want to. I didn't even tell him. Something about this felt like a door I needed to walk through alone. The Carter Law Group headquarters took up 20 floors of glass and steel. The building caught the morning light like a mirror, looming over the city with the same quiet arrogance I remembered from Elaine Carter's smile. Inside, everything gleamed: polished marble, sleek leather furniture, a reception desk staffed by 2 women in navy suits who offered me polite but shaken smiles as they pointed me toward the elevator. They didn't ask who I was. They already knew. When the doors opened on the 14th floor, the air felt different. Not cold, exactly, but sterile. Artificial. I stepped out and was immediately greeted by a tall man in an impeccably tailored suit, gray with a hint of blue, expensive in a way you can't name, only feel. He introduced himself as Martin Dell, managing partner. He didn't shake my hand. "Mr. Dalton," he said, gesturing down the hall, "thank you for coming. Please, follow me." The conference room he led me into could have housed a small wedding. Long glass table, city skyline behind us, 10 leather chairs on each side, and screens built into the walls that displayed nothing but the firm's crest. On the table were 3 thick folders, each marked confidential in red. He asked me to sit. I did, cautiously, the way you do when you're not sure if you're a guest or a witness. "Mr. Dalton," he began, "what I'm about to share is not public knowledge. But your son has made it necessary to act quickly, transparently, and, frankly, aggressively." I blinked. "Jason." Dell nodded, folding his hands. "Your son has spent the last 6 months documenting internal practices at this firm. Practices that, if verified, could represent not only violations of company policy, but state and federal law." He slid one of the folders toward me. Inside were pages of transcribed emails, screenshots, and printed text messages. Some from Elaine Carter. Some from Gregory. Some from other partners I didn't know. There were remarks about optics related to Jason's background, questions about his blue-collar roots and whether his lack of pedigree could damage Carter's brand if his company became too closely affiliated. My name came up. So did my job. One email, from Elaine herself, read, "We cannot be seen aligning with a founder whose father is a janitor. There are reputational implications." My chest burned. But I kept reading. Then came the recordings. Jason had clearly kept every voicemail, every casual insult disguised as advice, every joke whispered behind closed doors. In one, Gregory's voice could be heard mocking Jason's company, suggesting a slow bleed strategy to keep them dependent on Carter Law without giving them real footing. Another recording detailed how Elaine had redirected a major tech contract, worth $2.3 million, away from Jason's startup and toward a competing firm with established family ties. Dell sat across from me, quiet as I processed it all. Then he added, "He didn't tell anyone until this morning. He walked in at 6 a.m., asked for a private meeting, and put everything on the table." I didn't know what to say. My son had been carrying all of that. For months. Quietly, methodically. While smiling through business meetings. While planning a wedding. While knowing exactly what kind of people he was marrying into. And he'd kept it all. For this moment. Dell went on to explain that the firm had launched an immediate internal investigation. Elaine and Gregory had been suspended, pending a full review. There were already whispers about the board stepping in, about investor pressure, about reputation damage on a scale they hadn't seen in decades. But more than that, Dell said Jason's evidence had prompted other employees, junior partners, support staff, to come forward. Apparently, Jason's walkout had gone viral internally. People who had kept their mouths shut for years were suddenly unafraid to speak. Dell closed the folder gently. "This may very well become a class action. We're looking at systemic bias. Discriminatory hiring practices. targeted sabotage. Mr. Dalton, your son didn't just expose a scandal, he opened a door we may never be able to close. I looked out the window. The city stretched endlessly in every direction, but I didn't feel small. I felt something else entirely. Pride, sure. But deeper than that, I felt seen, not just by my son, but by a world that had spent most of my life pretending people like me didn't matter. I hadn't stepped into that building expecting anything more than a forced apology. Instead, I walked out of there carrying the knowledge that Jason hadn't just defended me in a garden full of strangers, he'd taken on an empire with nothing but patience, proof, and the quiet kind of strength I'd always hoped he'd learn. He had learned. And now the whole world was about to find out. The day of the second wedding, there were no valet attendants, no marble fountains, no tuxedoed staff holding silver trays of shrimp skewers. There were folding chairs on patchy grass, a picnic table covered in a checkered tablecloth, and the smell of someone's charcoal grill drifting from 2 houses down. It was held in my brother Mike's backyard, the same backyard where Jason learned how to ride a bike, where we'd once roasted marshmallows over a rusted fire pit and where I'd spent more weekends than I could count fixing up his shed or rewiring his fuse box. The air was warm, the kind of warmth that sinks into your skin without trying too hard. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was bracing for something. I just felt settled. There were about 50 people in total. Factory guys with oil under their nails, teachers from Jason's grade school, neighbors from our street growing up, even Mr. Ramirez from the hardware store below my apartment, who brought tamales wrapped in foil and refused to take back the empty tray. People brought folding chairs from home, set up card tables, and passed around coolers filled with homemade lemonade and bottles of soda. No place cards this time, no nameplates gilded in gold leaf. Just handwritten paper tents someone made that morning with a black Sharpie. Mine sat in front of a plate of potato salad, plain and honest, Frank Dalton, father of the groom. That alone would have been enough for me. But what really made me pause, what made me stop and take it all in, was the way Madison stood when it was her turn to speak. She wore a simple cream dress, something soft and modest, with her hair pulled back, no makeup but for a little lip gloss that caught the sun. When she stepped forward, her voice shook for just a second, but she didn't hide behind poise like she had before. She looked everyone in the eye. And then she said, "I want to begin today by saying something I should have said a long time ago. I was wrong." You could have heard a pin drop. She went on, calmly but clearly, denouncing the people who raised her. She didn't code it in niceties or try to soften it for the audience. She said, "What happened at that first wedding was more than just a mistake, it was a revelation. And it broke something in me that needed to break. I saw who my parents really were, and for the first time, I saw what they'd been trying to make me into." She paused. Her voice didn't crack, it held. "That night," she continued, "when Jason walked away, he taught me something I had never learned inside boardrooms or law school lecture halls. He showed me that love without respect is nothing. And that if you have to choose between approval and integrity, always choose integrity." She took a breath and added, "I've left Carter Law Group. Permanently. I've started a small legal practice focused entirely on labor rights and employee protections. Because the people who build our world deserve to be seen, to be heard, and to be protected." Someone clapped. Then someone else. And soon it turned into a real wave of applause, not out of politeness, but from something honest, like they were clapping for themselves too. Jason went up after her. No microphone, no stage. He just stood in the middle of the grass, hands folded in front of him, shirt sleeves rolled up, suspenders loose at his waist. He smiled at the crowd, and then he looked at me. "I didn't write anything down," he said. "But I want to say this." He turned slightly so we were eye to eye, and I felt my gut twist in the way it always had when he was about to say something too big for me to prepare for. "My dad," he said, "taught me what real worth looks like. Not the kind that sits in a bank account or gets printed on a business card, but the kind you carry in your chest. The kind you give away freely and never run out of. The kind that comes from doing the right thing when no one's watching, from choosing love over ego, again and again. He taught me that wealth isn't what you earn, it's what you give. And he gave me everything." He swallowed hard. "Real worth is built, not bought," he said. "And real wealth is love." I didn't cry, not then. Not in front of everyone. I just sat there with my hands in my lap, fingers curled around the edge of my paper plate, and let the words settle over me like sunlight. People came up afterward, patted me on the back, clinked their cups against mine, offered stories about Jason from when he was a kid, or about times I'd helped them with things I barely remembered. Someone passed around a plate of brownies. Someone else started up a playlist on a Bluetooth speaker. Kids ran between chairs barefoot. Nobody cared about posture or etiquette or which fork to use. It was messy and loud and beautiful. And through all of it, Jason never left my side for long. There were no fireworks. No dramatic toasts or choreographed dances. Just the quiet understanding that something good had happened. Something right. And maybe, for the first time in his life, Jason had started not just a marriage, but a real beginning. And I was there to see it. Right where I belonged. I keep the place card in the bottom drawer of my old red toolbox, tucked between a faded Father's Day card from when Jason was 7 and a spare wrench I can never seem to find when I actually need it. The card still smudged with chocolate fingerprints and crayon scribbles, big shaky letters that read, "Best Dad in the World." The place card, though, that place card, is printed in clean, serif font, stiff as cardboard, and says exactly what they wanted me to believe about myself: low-educated custodian. Pseudo-father. I don't keep it there to torture myself. I keep it there to remind me how far we've come. What they meant as an insult became something else. A marker. A boundary I watched my son cross and never look back from. It didn't take long after the wedding for things to change, and not just for me. Jason's company landed 3 major contracts within months. One of them, in a twist no one could have scripted better, came from Carter Law itself, now under completely new leadership. Apparently, the new board didn't care about optics so long as the work got done with integrity, and Jason's firm had proven it delivered with more class than the Carters ever had. I watched him sign the paperwork from across the room at the hardware store one afternoon, his laptop propped on a stack of paint cans. He didn't smile or gloat, just nodded once, like a craftsman inspecting a seam he knew would hold. Madison's world shifted just as fast. She'd poured herself into her new practice with the kind of purpose I think she'd been craving for years, something that wasn't gilded in status or hollow prestige. Her first major case? A workplace discrimination suit representing the night shift custodial crew from my old plant. Some of them were guys I'd worked shoulder to shoulder with, men who'd been talked over and ignored for decades. She treated them with dignity, every one of them, and when the judge ruled in their favor, she didn't throw a press conference or chase headlines. She just called me afterward, her voice quiet with something that sounded a lot like peace, and said, "I finally understand what you built for Jason. What it cost." I didn't know what to say to that. So I just said, "Thank you." But the moment that stayed with me most came a few weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon. Jason had come by to help replace the garbage disposal in my kitchen. We'd just finished tightening the last bolt when he leaned against the counter, wiped the sweat off his forehead, and pulled something out of his back pocket. It was a folded-up ultrasound photo. I stared at it for a second, not quite processing. Madison was pregnant. He handed it to me like it was sacred. His eyes were bright, the way they'd been when he was a kid holding up a straight-A report card, trying not to smile too wide. I felt the photo in my hand, thin, black and white, little bean-shaped blur right in the middle. My first grandchild. My boy was going to be a father. He didn't say much at first, just let me stand there in silence, staring at the image of a future I never dared to imagine. Then he said, almost shyly, "I already know the kind of father I want to be, because I learned from the best." That broke something in me. Or maybe it fixed something that had been cracked for a long time. I don't know. But I had to sit down, right there on the step stool, wiping at my face with the hem of my shirt, pretending the kitchen just got a little too dusty. I never had a title that mattered to people in suits. No plaques, no framed degrees, no business cards with embossed lettering. What I had was a workbench stained with oil, a pair of hands that never stopped finding ways to fix what was broken, and a boy who grew up knowing that every second of my life was built around him. And now, somehow, that's enough. In a world obsessed with credentials and power and polished perfection, I got to watch my son walk away from all of it. I got to see him build something with real weight, love, resilience, truth. I got to see a woman find her voice and use it for people who've never had one. I got to sit in a backyard wedding surrounded by people who knew exactly who I was, and not one of them needed a nameplate to recognize it. Sometimes I take the card out of the toolbox, just for a minute. I hold it next to that smudged Father's Day card, the one Jason made with construction paper and glue and too many stickers. One tells me what the world thought I was. The other tells me who I've always been. And between the two, there's no contest. I close the drawer, wipe my hands, and get back to work.